What's up, guys? Welcome to a new day. I'm Stephanie Ryder, and this is the 365 Shares podcast. It's Saturday, January 6th, 2024, and this is the 6th episode of the 365 Shares podcast. Today's topic is abusive relationships. This is a juicy one. And I'm just going to give a little bit of background on how I've decided to handle the readings. I don't read them the day before or ahead of time. I read them just right as I'm sitting down to record this podcast because that's how we typically have it in our meetings. I don't pick a topic on my own at home and read all the passages and then come into a meeting and say, oh, I read about this topic, so I think we should all read about this. It really happens in the moment. If I feel strongly that something's going on in my life, I will suggest that as a topic, but people typically take turns suggesting topics. And if there's a conflict, like if two people really felt strongly that they wanted their topic to be presented or talked about, then, sometimes we'll split and talk about one. I even did a meeting once where I was leading and I just went back and forth. Like every other reading was that other topic, and it worked out fine. So I just like to sort of be inspired in the moment. I don't like to spend a lot of time planning what I'm going to say. Obviously, I always have what's on my mind, but it's not a forethought out like, okay, we got to get ready for Saturday's episode, and this is what we're going to talk about, and here's some examples. I really just want this to be spontaneous and off the cuff. I don't want it to be something scripted and performative because that just feels more authentic to me, and that goes more along with my goal for this podcast, which is that this is primarily a time capsule for me of my thoughts and my progress in the program and in my life. But today, the topic is on abusive relationships. The quote from the Big Red Book is, "We stay in abusive relationships because they resemble how we were raised." And I've talked about this before. This is something that I tackled early on in my post-divorce therapy or post-separation therapy, what my old therapist called the Imago principle. And it's kind of based on Freud saying that we put ourselves in similar situations to what we've been in the past so that we can reopen that wound and heal it. And it's really hard when you are in an abusive relationship. It's really hard when you are in a failed relationship or a failing relationship to acknowledge why you picked that person other than all the positive things. Because I had, multiple therapists just keep asking me over and over, like, but why did you pick him? Given everything he was doing in the present day, everything he had lied about, everything he was trying to do behind my back, all the intentional misleading that he was doing, the drinking, the dissociating, just everything that was going on. And when I would come in and talk about him and cry and complain or like say the things that he was doing that were hurting me, I obviously wasn't presenting, at the end of our relationship, all of the positive things. And they just kept asking me, like, why did you pick him? And I was like, because I loved him. He was great. He was the best boyfriend I ever had. He was attentive. He was intelligent. We went through so many questions of things that we valued and things that we wanted in our lives. And we were so in alignment on an intellectual level with what we wanted. But then it just fell apart emotionally for both of us on both sides as a result of our own respective upbringings and bringing that to the table. And so I picked him subconsciously because he represented certain members of my family and certain ways of doing things in my family that were still ongoing, that had not been resolved. And he picked me for the same reason. So first and foremost, grace for anyone who is in or has been in an abusive relationship. I would never judge anyone. I have been in some doozies with some wild narcissists, and I have myself been a wild narcissist in a relationship, and I have done things that are abusive as well. So grace for anyone, past, present, future relationships. We're all doing our best. The affirmation for today is, on this day, I will choose the best path for my emotional health. I prepare myself to make life-changing decisions to remove myself from my abusive relationships. And as I've been talking about this week, the abusive relationship that I am currently removing myself from is that, unfortunately, with my family of origin. It's not physically abusive, thankfully, but there is definitely verbal abuse. There is a lot of bullying and a lot of commitment to dysfunctional coping mechanisms and sort of attacking anyone who isn't in alignment with those coping mechanisms, because to those people are the right way to live. Very black and white thinking, which is a big common denominator among people who have been raised in dysfunctional homes. Someone's either all bad or they're all good. Something is right or wrong. There's not a lot of gray area. I'm Steph, and this is my share. I really have focused so much in my therapy and in my recovery on taking triggers as an opportunity. And so by that, I mean, if someone does something that upsets me, that puts me into a rage, that makes me cry, just anything that brings up such intense feelings, I always try to think about them as an iceberg where only the top 10% of the iceberg is above the water. And we've all seen that image of, the 90% of this huge iceberg that's under the water, where it can look like something so innocuous on the surface, but it's comprised of this cumulative buildup in our lifetimes of all this hurt. So if someone says something to me, like a partner, and I'm just so overwhelmed with the strongest emotion, it's pretty sure that what he said was just triggering this sort of lifetime of hurt that I had inside me that hasn't yet been healed. And when someone triggers me, when I hit an iceberg, I try to see it as an opportunity to say, okay, we have found an iceberg. They are difficult to find because so little of them is above the water. But when we find them, we have an opportunity to stay and chisel this iceberg down bit by bit so that we won't run into it again. And I have had a lot of experiences where I've said, I've taken into therapy, and especially with EMDR, which is, I think, the greatest tool for working through trauma and triggers, and just taking something that's such an overwhelming feeling or experience and turning it into something manageable. And so the biggest part of that, that identifying when you're feeling triggered like that, is figuring out what makes up that 90% of the iceberg that's below the surface. And so that's when you start to sort of work backward in your life, where you say, okay, when has this happened in my career? When has this happened in previous romantic relationships? When does this happen in my sibling relationships? Did my parents do this? Did other caretakers who raised me do this? Teachers, coaches, you have this whole world of hurt that you've just clumped together into a huge iceberg. And you're unconsciously or subconsciously putting yourself into a situation in your modern day life, in your present day life, with a romantic partner, with someone else, to get to that iceberg and to figure out, like, okay, what I actually need to heal is not just the fight that I had with my boyfriend this morning, but what I actually need to heal is the times all growing up when I heard that I was a failure if I made a mistake, or if love was withheld from me because I didn't act in accordance with the family rules, and I got like the silent treatment or just the iciest energy, withholding eye contact, things like that. So that original experience, cumulative experience, complex PTSD, that's what we try to get to. And when I was doing EMDR with my therapist, she would say, what is your earliest memory of that thing happening, that type of thing? And then you just sort of sit, and I would close my eyes and just sort of let it bubble to the surface. And then this horrible memory would surface. And you would say, oh, it was that. This was either the first time it happened or the biggest time that it happened, or a representative, quintessential example of that thing happening. And then we would go into that experience and sort of passively, as if you are Harry Potter, envisioning the scene that took place in the past, or experiencing the scene that took place in the past, then you would sort of reenact it in your mind and say, that's what they said. this is what I said, or this is how I felt, or this is what happened. And then we would imagine a different outcome. And my therapist would say, what is the negative self you internalized as a result of this thing happening? So one example would be that I'm a failure. Something may have happened. I may have failed a test, or I may have gotten sick and couldn't go to a final, or my anxiety got the best of me, or whatever it was. And I would hear that I was a failure in that moment. And when a parent says that you failed at something, they might just be referring to that specific instance. But when you're a kid, what you hear is that you did not fail. There was not a failure made by you. You are a failure. And it becomes about you. And it becomes part of who you are, where there's this little voice that lives inside you all the time in the back of your mind that says you're a failure. And when I was getting divorced, when my husband left me, and it was clear that I was not going to be able to save my marriage, which I tried hard to do, the feeling that I was a failure, internalized by a lifetime of hearing my grandmother just criticize people who had gotten divorces and always say that it was the wife's responsibility to make the marriage work, and that if you were a good wife and if you were a success, you could overcome any marriage obstacle and make your marriage work. And she was coming from a place where she had put up with unbelievable treatment, but many times by my grandfather, verbal abuse, cheating, lack of trust, outbursts, just so many things. They were both adult children of alcoholics themselves. And she made the marriage work by just gritting her teeth and doing a lot of difficult things and making that choice. And she was really proud of herself. But instead of saying, I'm proud of myself for overcoming what I did, for making my marriage work despite the difficulties, she turned that into anyone who didn't make their marriage work, anyone who couldn't overcome the way she overcame. Those people were failures and she was a success. And that is an example of her black and white thinking, because if she was not a success, she was a failure. So she had to cast herself as the successful wife, the success story, and anyone who couldn't make it work, including my mother, who was already dead at the time, but who had not made either of her marriages work. I had internalized that messaging, and it had never been directed at me. She had never accused me of being someone who would be in an unsuccessful marriage. She never told me she thought my marriage was going to fail. It was just listening to her talk about the world and other women in the world and how the way things worked. And she was so convinced of her idea of the way the world worked that it was the way the world worked. And so you take as a kid a lot of things just at face value. Like something a parent says is the truth. You just take it as face value. So when I was going through my, my divorce, I felt like a failure. And because I was a failure, I wanted to kill myself, because why would I live if I was a failure? And there was no way to redeem yourself in this paradigm that my grandmother had created. So for that example of, we would go in and say, what do you want to believe instead? Because I had internalized the belief that I was a failure. And of course you want to believe that you're not a failure, but more positively, that you have opportunity to succeed again in the future. And I would go into that memory and say, imagine that your grandmother had compassion for everyone and for herself, and said something more realistic, such as, marriage is really hard, and it's sad that those people couldn't make it work. My marriage was really hard, and I'm proud of myself that I made it work. And just imagining her saying that, and imagining my younger self taking that as gospel, takes so much of the weight of this memory off my chest. Growing up in an imaginary scenario where you heard positive messaging and you heard grace and you heard gray area and you heard realism instead of just denial or coping mechanisms, makes it so much easier to say, yes, I got married, and yes, my marriage did not work, and Of course, I have accountability in that not working, but I learned so much out of that experience. In so many ways, I'm a different person, a better person because of that experience. It started me on a much needed therapy journey to heal childhood wounds and ongoing family dysfunction. And the people I've met since then, the loves that I've had in my life since then, I would never, ever go back to a place where I didn't experience that and I didn't meet those people. And I wouldn't even go back to a place where I could be with my ex-husband again, even if it would mean that I was not, quote unquote, a failure. So again, to anyone who's in an abusive relationship, emotional, physical, any kind of abuse, to anyone who has been in an abusive relationship, you don't have to stay in it. And you also don't have to judge yourself for having been in it, for currently being in it, for getting out of it but missing it, for even going back to it. Just nothing but love for anyone who has been in any of these experiences, because I have been in all of them myself and I survived them and I learned something from every single one of them. And I healed myself so much by being triggered and identifying those triggers. So please just take away from this episode that anytime you're mad or sad or have any emotion that's so overwhelming, I hope there's just a little voice in the back of your head, like a Jiminy Cricket, that says, hey, this is an opportunity.